What if I told you that one of America's greatest racing victories was built on a lie? That the hero who made it possible was betrayed by the very company he saved? This is the story they don't want you to know. Picture this. It's 1963, and Henry Ford II, yeah, the grandson of the Henry Ford, is sitting in a boardroom getting absolutely humiliated. For months, Ford had been trying to buy Ferrari. We're talking about a deal that would have combined American manufacturing muscle with Italian racing magic. The contracts were ready, the lawyers were happy, and Ford was about to own the most prestigious name in motorsports. Then Enzo Ferrari, that arrogant Italian bastard, pulls the rug out from under them. Not only does he walk away from the deal, but he basically calls Ford a bunch of assembly line amateurs who wouldn't know real racing if it bit them in the ass. Now, if you know anything about the Ford family, you know they don't take insults lying down. Henry Ford II's face went red, and he made a declaration that would change racing forever. "Build me a car that will destroy Ferrari at Le Mans." This wasn't just business anymore, guys. This was personal. This was war. Ford had the money. We're talking about $100 million in today's cash. But money can't buy you racing DNA. For that, they needed someone who understood speed, someone who lived and breathed motorsports. Enter Carroll Shelby, a Texas cowboy with balls the size of church bells and a racing resume that could make grown men weep. Shelby was everything Ford's corporate suits weren't. Rough around the edges, willing to take risks, and absolutely obsessed with going fast. But Shelby knew something the Ford executives didn't. You can't just throw money at a problem and expect to beat Ferrari. You need more than engineers in lab coats. You need someone who can feel what a car is thinking. Someone who can push a machine to its absolute limit and then tell you exactly why it broke. That's when Shelby made the call that would change everything. Ken Miles wasn't your typical American racing hero. Hell, he wasn't even American. This guy was British, sharp-tongued, and had zero patience for corporate bullshit. He was a World War II veteran who'd rather be elbow-deep in an engine than shaking hands with executives. The Ford suits hated him immediately. He didn't look the part, didn't talk the part, and sure as hell didn't play politics. But Carroll Shelby? Shelby saw something special. Ken Miles wasn't just a driver, he was a car whisperer. This guy could take one lap around a track and tell you exactly what was wrong with your suspension, your aerodynamics, and your engine tuning. He didn't just drive cars, he had conversations with them. When the GT40 program started, it was a complete disaster. These cars were fast, sure, but they were also death traps. They overheated, broke down, and crashed out of races faster than you could say Ferrari. The Italian press was having a field day, and Ford executives were starting to panic. But while everyone else was pointing fingers, Ken Miles was rolling up his sleeves. He'd come off the track after a test session and give the engineers a masterclass in what was wrong. Not in some fancy technical language, but in plain English that even the corporate guys could understand. "The rear end's loose coming out of turn 3, he'd say. "The brakes are fading after lap 5. And this engine's running hotter than a $2 pistol." Then he'd grab a wrench and start fixing it himself. See, Ken understood something that the bean counters in Detroit never got. Racing isn't just about having the fastest car. It's about having a car that can survive 24 hours of absolute hell while still being fast enough to win. Under Ken's guidance, the GT40 started evolving from a pretty failure into a legitimate weapon. Every breakdown became a lesson. Every crash became data. And slowly, very slowly, Ford started to have something that could actually challenge Ferrari. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where Ford's corporate machine started showing its true colors. Now, Here's a part of the story that Ford really doesn't want you to know about. That beautiful, revolutionary GT40 that became an American icon? Yeah, well, it wasn't exactly American innovation. Over in England, there was this brilliant engineer named Eric Broadley, who'd built something called the Lola MK6. This thing was a work of art, lightweight, aerodynamic, and years ahead of its time. It had everything the GT40 would later become famous for: the low-slung body, the mid-engine layout, the revolutionary chassis design. Ford saw it and basically said, "We'll take that." They threw money at Broadley's company, brought him into the fold, and started absorbing everything he'd created. At first, it looked like a partnership. Broadley got resources he could only dream of, and Ford got the engineering genius they desperately needed. But this is corporate America we're talking about, and corporate America doesn't like sharing credit. As the GT40 program ramped up, Ford's executives started squeezing Broadley out. They wanted his designs, his innovations, his revolutionary thinking, but they didn't want his name on the final product. Within a year, Eric Broadley was sidelined, his contributions buried under layers of Ford marketing. The GT40's DNA, its very soul, came from that British workshop. But Ford wasn't interested in telling that story. They were building an empire, and empires are written by the winners. Meanwhile, the engine that would power this beast was being developed by Ford's team, led by guys like Carroll Smith and Roy Lunn. They took a massive 7.0-liter V8, a real iron block monster, and turned it into a racing legend. The mechanics who worked on this engine didn't call it by its factory designation. Late at night in the garages, they gave it a nickname that perfectly captured its personality: the Sidewinder. Why? Because like the venomous snake, this engine was brutally efficient and deadly if you didn't respect it. But when everything was tuned just right, it had a vicious, unpredictable strike of power that could win races. Driver Dan Gurney put it best. It didn't sing like a Ferrari 512. It shouted. It was a sledgehammer, and sometimes in endurance racing, you need a sledgehammer. By now, Ford had their weapon. They had the chassis genius stolen from Broadley, the engine power developed by their team, and most importantly, they had Ken Miles to make it all work together. Ferrari was about to get a very rude awakening. The early GT40 races were absolutely brutal to watch. These cars would roar off the starting line looking like world beaters, then break down, overheat, or crash out before the halfway point. Ferrari drivers were probably laughing so hard they could barely steer. But Ken Miles saw something everyone else missed. While Ford executives were having panic attacks and Carroll Shelby was chain-smoking Marlboros, Ken was taking notes. Every failure was teaching him something new about the car. He wasn't just driving these machines, he was having full-blown conversations with them. He could feel when the suspension was getting loose, sense when the brakes were starting to fade, and predict when the engine was about to overheat. "The car talks to you," Ken once told a reporter. "You just have to know how to listen." And slowly, race by race, test session by test session, the GT40 started becoming something special. Ken would come off the track and give the engineers a complete dissertation on what needed fixing. Then he'd grab his tools and help fix it himself. By 1965, something had changed. The GT40 wasn't just competitive, it was dominant. First came Daytona. Ken Miles took that Ford and absolutely destroyed the competition. No breakdowns, no mechanical failures, just pure speed and precision. The racing world suddenly realized that the Americans weren't just throwing money at the problem anymore. They were building real race cars. Then came Sebring, another brutal endurance test. Once again, Ken was untouchable. Lap after lap, his driving was surgical. He knew exactly when to push, when to conserve, and when to make his move. Ford had proven they could win races. But Henry Ford II wanted more than just victories. He wanted to humiliate Ferrari on the biggest stage in motorsports, Le Mans. The 24 Hours of Le Mans wasn't just a race, it was a religion. Ferrari had owned this track for years, and beating them there would be the ultimate revenge for that boardroom humiliation back in 1963. As 1966 approached, everything was falling into place. The GT40 was fast, reliable, and proven. Ken Miles was driving like a man possessed. Carroll Shelby's team was firing on all cylinders. But in the polished executive suites of Ford Motor Company, another plan was taking shape. A plan that would give Ford their greatest PR victory, and Ken Miles his most crushing defeat. The stage was set for one of the most controversial finishes in racing history. June 18, 1966, the 24 Hours of Le Mans. This was it, Ford's moment of truth. 3 GT40s lined up on the grid, ready to take on Ferrari's finest. And leading the charge was Ken Miles, the man who'd poured his heart and soul into making this moment possible. From the drop of the green flag, Ken was absolutely untouchable. While other drivers were pushing their cars to the breaking point, Ken was dancing on the edge of perfection. He knew every corner, every breaking point, every gear change by heart. Lap after lap, he pulled away from the field. Ferrari's cars, those supposedly superior Italian machines, started dropping like flies. Mechanical failures, crashes, driver errors. Ferrari was falling apart while Ford dominated. As the sun came up over Le Mans, Ken Miles was leading by 4 full laps. 4 laps. In a 24-hour race, that's not just winning, that's complete domination. In the pits, Carroll Shelby was grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. They'd done it. They'd built the fastest, most reliable race car in the world, and Ken Miles was about to etch his name into racing history. But up in the executive suite, Henry Ford II and his corporate cronies were having a different conversation. See, winning wasn't enough for these guys. They wanted headlines. They wanted magazine covers. They wanted a photo that would sell Ford cars for the next decade. So they came up with what they thought was a brilliant idea: a staged photo finish. Instead of letting Ken Miles cross the line alone in triumph, they wanted all 3 Ford cars to finish side by side in perfect formation. The marketing department was probably salivating. Picture it: 3 Ford GT40s crossing the finish line together, completely dominating Ferrari. It would be the greatest PR photo in automotive history. There was just one problem with this brilliant plan. The Le Mans rules were very specific about how winners were determined. If 2 cars finished at the same time, the one that had started further back on the grid would be declared the winner. Ken Miles had started further down the grid than Bruce McLaren and the other Ford. If they crossed the line together, McLaren would get the victory. Carroll Shelby fought like hell for Ken. He argued with the executives, warned them about the rules, begged them to let the man who'd earned the victory have his moment in the sun. But the suits didn't give a damn about Ken Miles. This wasn't about racing anymore. This was about corporate image, marketing campaigns, and selling cars to suburban dads. With just minutes left in the race, the radio crackled in Ken's car. Back off. Slow down. Wait for the others. Ken couldn't believe what he was hearing. He'd led this race for 23 hours and 50 minutes. He'd earned this victory with every ounce of skill, courage, and determination he had. But he was a team player. Against every instinct screaming in his head, Ken Miles lifted off the throttle and watched his 4-lap lead disappear. As the 3 Ford GT40s approached the finish line in perfect formation, cameras flashed and the crowd went wild. Ford had their picture-perfect ending. Then came the announcement that crushed Ken Miles' soul. Bruce McLaren was the official winner of the 1966 24 Hours of Le Mans. The pit lane went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Then the shock gave way to anger, and the anger gave way to heartbreak. Carroll Shelby threw his hat on the ground and cursed loud enough to wake the dead. The mechanics who'd worked their asses off for Ken just stood there in disbelief. And Ken? Ken Miles just stood there quietly, his blue eyes fixed on the scoreboard that showed someone else's name at the top. The man who'd built the GT40 with his own hands, who'd led the race with absolute dominance, who'd given Ford their ultimate triumph over Ferrari, had been robbed of his moment in history. For a photo op. After Le Mans, the cracks in the team became impossible to hide. Shelby was furious with Ford's executives. Ken, usually quick with a sharp comment or a joke, grew quiet and distant. He'd spent his entire life proving doubters wrong, fighting his way to the top of his profession, only to watch it all get stolen in the final seconds by corporate politics. But Ken Miles was a professional. He smiled for the cameras, shook hands with McLaren, and congratulated the team. Inside, though, something had broken that would never heal. 2 months later, Ken was back at the test track, pushing Ford's next experimental car to its limits. Some say he was trying to prove a point. Others believe he was searching for the redemption that Le Mans had stolen from him. On August 17, 1966, at Riverside Raceway in California, Ken Miles climbed into Ford's new J car for a high-speed test. The car was faster and more dangerous than anything he'd driven before. At 200 miles per hour, something went wrong. The experimental aerodynamics failed, and the J car became airborne, flipping and catching fire in a horrific crash. Ken Miles was killed instantly. The man who should have been celebrating as the Le Mans champion, the man who'd given Ford their greatest racing weapon, never got his moment in the sun. Ford got their photo. Ferrari got their ass kicked. But motorsports lost something irreplaceable that day at Le Mans. For decades, Ken Miles' story was buried under corporate PR and sanitized racing histories. But the truth has a way of surfacing, and today, Ken Miles is remembered, not for the victory he lost, but for the genius, courage, and heart he brought to racing. The 2019 movie Ford v Ferrari introduced a new generation to his story. And finally, the world learned about the man who deserved everything and was given nothing. Ken Miles may have been denied his Le Mans victory, but his legacy is bigger than any trophy. He proved that real champions aren't made in boardrooms. They're forged in garages, on test tracks, and in the heat of competition. And that's a truth no corporate spin can ever erase.